this morning's distinguished lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Gerard Goggin. Gerard is Professor of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney, and from mid-July 2019, the week in we chair of Communication Studies at NTU. For over 20 years, he's been deeply involved in research, policy formulation, and the public debates concerning technology, especially its social and cultural implications. Professor Goggin is a leading figure in a number of academic fields, including mobile communication and media research, digital inclusion, disability and digital technology, and internet histories. His key publications include Local Technologies in International Context, 2019, Normality and Disability, 2018, Routledge Companion to Global Internet Histories, 2017, Disability and the Media, 2015, Internationalizing Internet Studies, 2009, Cell Phone Culture and Digital Disability. Professor Goggin has served on the Australian E-Research Infrastructure Council, Australian Council of Learned Academies, landmark study for government on the role of technology in society, and recently, with a group of international colleagues, co-authored the chapter on media and communications for the 3-volume report of the International Panel on Social Progress. In 2018, he chaired the Humanities and Creative Arts panel for the inaugural Australian Research Council Engagement and Impact Research Evaluation. Without further ado, let me now invite Professor Goggin to deliver his lecture today on digital society at a crossroads, shared futures for technology and humanity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Luke, for the warm welcome. And thank you to the Centre for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and to the new Institute for Science and Tech for Humanity for sponsoring the selection for the opportunity. And thanks for coming along on the first day of your semester. Greatly appreciated. So today I wanted to talk about the concept, I suppose, of digital society at a crossroads. So it's probably something of a conceit, but it hopefully is one that's useful. In some ways, this is a kind of first cut or an early work in progress about trying to think at a grander scale about this. It has all sorts of problems, of course. The first is about the varieties of the digital, about what one might be talking to, talking about the, kind of generalising about a range of things. But let's see how it goes, and you can let me know. So I suppose what I'm interested in particularly, and I think it is useful perhaps at this kind of moment to sort of think about this, that to think about digital technology and where we've got to about this. And I think if we are looking for an area that's kind of key to our futures, key to humanity as we might understand it, key to some of the what's seen internationally around grand challenges, but I think also in terms of many research disciplines as well, trying to grapple from different areas. I know that for each of our disciplines and across the interdisciplinary work, there's a lot of traditions of work that goes back around many of these kind of areas that I'll be, I'll be sort of drawing upon or taking advantage of here, and not necessarily engaging with directly. But I think there is a sense that there is a shared kind of project that's worth tackling. And I think digital technology brings some of these issues together. And I think from my perspective, there's a sense, I think, within the last year or so, that, digital society is in crisis in many ways. I don't know if I'd lean too kind of heavily on the concept or really necessarily want to go too far into the trench with digital society. But I think this whole idea around the reliance in societies that many of us do live in on digital technologies, this has become more and more a feature of our lives. It's become more of a feature of our economies. It's become more of a feature of politics. It's become more of a feature of our intimate relationships. This is very uneven. This works in different ways. Often there's a sort of injunction or an incitement to the digital that actually doesn't do justice to actually what people might want to do around technology, what people might want to do about their lives. But nonetheless, I think there is a sense that digital society such as it is in crisis. So what I want to try and do in the next kind of half an hour or so, and allow a bit of time for discussion as well, is to say, well, if this is the case, how did it happen, broadly, and where do we go from here? And I think the reason, as I was just saying at the outset, why this is useful to do, is I think this does offer us some really important lessons for the broader project of thinking around how do we put complex science and technology into the service of humanity. And I think there's a kind of particular link here between digital technology and broader questions of technology and broader questions of science. And I think this is partly because if we think, using this kind of catch cry of the fourth industrial society, if we have a next phase of digital technology that's underway, but also we have another phase of kind of next phase of internet and next phase of digital technology. If you think, for instance, of the Internet of Things, the combinations of sensors, of networks, of personalisation of technology. We have some integration of other technology systems going on, I think, in a new kind of way that people are grappling with in different ways. That we have, digital technologies increasingly coming together with mobility systems, with other kinds of technology. So I think there's some usefulness in this. So that's what I want to just kind of explore and to talk a little bit about today. But just to give you some context, and I might just sort of take a seat at this stage. So my background is as a communications, media and cultural studies sociologist, sort of scholar. But I've worked for the last 20 or so years on social, cultural and policy implications of technology, and particularly with a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations and engagements with government, with industry, with civil society. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of those, some current and future projects include a great project on digital rights and governance in Australia and Asia, a new lab at the University of Sydney that I'm directing with the anthropologist Heather Horst and with the game scholar Marcus Carter, which we're calling the STUFF Lab, the Socio-Technical Futures Lab, and a big bid that we've just put in at the end of the year for a centre of excellence on automated decision-making in society that we're particularly excited about. And a project that's of particular interest to me on emerging social technology, on capitalising on diversity and digital inclusion in design and policy. So this is a kind of large-scale project, and actually it's in development, and that draws on the last sort of dot point I've mentioned there. For the last 4 years, I've been working on disability, which is a really cutting-edge kind of, I think, new area, both in sort of social and political and cultural life, but also around technology. So I've been doing a project about disability, digital technology, rights and innovation. And I'm really interested in trying to bring that together with a set of other concerns across a range of other groups, and to try and tackle some of the sense in which, although there's a great sense that technology is going to do great things for us, it turns out that when some of the technology is being designed, despite evidence and research to the contrary, a lot of groups in society are excluded from it. So I'm interested in thinking through that through some key areas, and I've published a number of papers, so I've got papers in press on some of the topics such as connected cars. I've just done a paper on connected cars and disability, trying to look at the ways in which work of companies like Waymo, for instance, Google's spin-off company, in how they're designing driverless cars is, on one hand, it's laudable. They're engaging with the needs of the diverse group of people with disabilities. On the other hand, there's a sort of, in some way, systematic missing out on the opportunity to actually engage with those groups. So to just mention a couple of other contexts, which I think Professor Luke did as well, Asian Internet Histories Project is something that I've been doing over a number of years, for about 4 years with a group of scholars, and we did a comparative study of the development of the internet in Australia, in Japan, in China and in Korea. And part of the premise on that, and it flows through a bit when in just a part of the paper, is about also trying to look at actually the kind of the work that scholars have done on histories of the internet in those languages that's not in the Anglophone literatures. I'm sure that's familiar terrain for many of you working across those sort of areas. And we've had publications out of that, such as a Companion to Global Internet Histories, and then the social cultural dynamics of mobile communication and media. Okay, so that perhaps just might give you a bit of a flavour of, I suppose, where I'm coming from and what feeds into this. So let me, I suppose, just get into just proposing this kind of argument, I suppose, to say, so firstly, I think there is a sense in which we can probably obviously say that the rise of digital technology is underpinning global societies. We can see how that plays out. And that for many of us, and I think we still need to understand, and many of us working in research, again, across different kinds of traditions in different ways, different engagements, trying to understand kind of what still this means. We might know what this means in relation to some digital technologies, but we still actually lack a lot of the evidence about people's everyday uses of a range of digital technologies, some of the meanings of those technologies, where they fit into broader cultural settings, how it feeds back into a design process, and particularly then coming into what the next wave of technology development is. But nonetheless, we can see that digital society is a kind of reality. And it is being urged upon us as well, and has been, I think, for 20 or 30 years. We think the digital default policies that the UK government pioneered in some ways 4 or 5 years ago, other countries have taken up, been one way of doing this. And we can see, and I've just got a few images here to kind of, you could pick different coordinates of this, but this is in the 798 Arts Precinct in Beijing, where you've got the kind of universal symbol of bathrooms with the binaries there, but you also have the Wi-Fi signals as well. A couple of images of one of mobile phone cases alongside a Singtel ad about gaming. I think just the sense in which a lot of our cultural lives, happens online. And then some of the, I suppose, the kind of imagining of digital here, and I have in mind Modi's Digital India, and I know that he's also visited recently and engaged with the robots at NTU. And then the many ways in which technologies that people are, I think, increasingly critical of actually underpin aspects of our lives. So I was intrigued coming through Narita Airport that once you've got your smartphone open, you get an AI buddy just coming up asking you about things. And that many of the ways in which we consume media, that we're living our everyday lives, have got these technologies threaded through them in terms of technologies such as Netflix and Spotify. But I think one thing that's really gathered pace in the last kind of year or so is, I think, something of a legitimation crisis. Again, I don't know the extent to which I'd really want to hang my hat on this, but I think there is a sense in which people across different societies and at a global level have really wanted to say, actually, there is a point now where this is not working, where this is a real problem, where we might, in our everyday use, not use, which is one of the features, I think, when in doing technology research around use, there's a real continuum, right, between use and non-use and what that means, and that different scholars have explored this. And so people, of course, might abandon a platform like MySpace 10 or 15 years ago, and it sort of sits probably like a ruined wreck of a ship somewhere, and people go on to another digital platform. So that's one form of this. But I think there's ways in which people have also, in a sense in which the stakes are higher because of the enlistment of people into social life now, with that social is going along with the technology in a way that's intermeshed. People are very increasingly uncomfortable about that because more of life is lived online. Yet when I say that, I always have this sense of it really depends, doesn't it? It depends where you live, in what sense. So I put that perhaps under erasure because I think that's kind of problematic as well. But I think the benefits hang in the balance. And, this is one list of, some public concerns, but there are many of them, right? So the data privacy, the surveillance, particularly the dystopian character of social media platforms, the quality of social connection and civil and political participation, colleagues here have worked on those issues for a long time. And then some of the newer issues over the last 5 or so years about algorithms, automated decision-making, discrimination, fairness, appropriate use. People say, actually, should we use these? Should we be using algorithms for sentencing in custodial matters, in courts? What are the limits? Where do we come back? These are issues, I suppose, that we've seen elsewhere in relation to biotechnology, for instance, in a range of technology. And I'm not sure that in digital technology it's played out in a similar way. They're quite different. There's the ongoing issues of digital inclusion and exclusion. And again, sometimes there's a bit of a sense here, depending on the societies. If you look at the diffusion curves on two of the main technologies, internet and mobiles, there's a sort of diffusion curve that probably goes from the early 90s through to the early 2000s, and you've got countries, Nordic countries, for instance, or some other countries where you see very high rates of mobile phone usage in the 90s, early 2000s. Then you see a bunch of other countries in the sort of last 10 or so years of just dramatic increases, China, India, and you see countries in the last 3 to 5 years, Polynesia, Micronesia, other countries in the Pacific, really getting a fast diffusion curve on, say, mobile platforms, and at the same time social media platforms coming on those all at the same time. Yet you still do really have really big issues about digital inequality and exclusion that have become in some ways more complex to unpick because people have realised that just pointing to a kind of presence and absence of ownership of a phone, for instance, doesn't cut it because it's much more complex than that. The ideas of platforms in many other ways, people have finally realised perhaps that things are more complex. Then you have the issues of digital governance and rights. This broad sense in which people feel that, how are things governed? How can control be taken back? But how, for a range of different players, should governance happen? And when it's not just a matter of earlier ideas about regulation, whether that's economy-wide regulation, whether it's sector-specific regulation, and it's not just what used to be called industry self-regulation, but it's the idea that you have great complexities now in digital platforms where where we are supposed to come in and play a role. I always find this hard when you're travelling, for instance, and you're doing Airbnb, because you can't just kind of go to a hotel, let's say. You then have to review and rank things. And then if you don't do that, you're a bad consumer and it plays out, right? This is one aspect in which you have these distributed kind of governance models going on. Okay, so in trying to make sense of this, in this very interesting piece of work that I was involved with about 16 scholars from around the world that was led by Nick Coldry and Clemencia Rodriguez, we wrote a chapter on media and communications as part of the report on the International Panel of Social Progress. And this was a really interesting project, and we were kind of chuffed that media and communications made it into, the high table of social progress. Though we might have thought social progress, had a few problems for how you conceptualise this. But what was really, I suppose, of interest to us to try and give some overall sense of what's going on is this kind of dilemma that people's dependence, which I have in a quote here, increasing dependence on an online infrastructure that mediates daily life increases the importance of corporations which provide the infrastructure. So through this you have the shift in media infrastructures with the shift of governance. And then you also have a distribution of media resources. And one of the issues is about who has control over this. That this is trying to generalise, but there is a skew towards the rich and powerful and away from the majority of the world's population. Now, this is arguable, I'm sure. It would be really interesting to talk more about this. But this is the judgment we made, I suppose, at this point in time. But I think one of the interesting things about this is it goes against the grain in some ways of how people often present or how digital technologies are presented. And I suppose just two further things to take out of that, which might be useful here. One of the issues that we felt in trying to look at digital technologies is to say there's not the one space of connection, but there's many spaces, and the relationship between them is highly unequal. That the questions of language and culture, unequal influence over internet governance, software localization and technical design, or make the internet in particular a highly uneven playing field for diverse groups, especially cultural and linguistic minorities. I think this was particularly salient to us as a group of 16 or so scholars from different parts of the world, and trying to give some sense of how digital technologies have played out, and feeling the stories were quite different, and how would you generalise across them? And then feeling that some of the available indicators, even I think, notable work that UNESCO's been doing, say, currently UNESCO's got a project on internet universality indicators. So one of the things is, because that's tied in with sustainable development goals and some of the UN kind of indicators, thinking, okay, that's great if we know how many people have access to mobile phones and internet, but what does that mean for particularly language groups or particular cultural groups in terms of that? You need a kind of more complex account. And I suppose another central issue that we were sort of trying to comment on was this issue about, that I think animates many people and is at the heart of, I think, a legitimation crisis, is how do you design the online spaces for respectful engagement, or for disagreement at some levels, some kind of okay conflict, without the excesses of hate speech, without the gamergates, without a whole range of other really troubling, kind of difficult sorts of interactions. How do you do this, and how do you get action for social progress? So I just got a couple of sets of images here to just sort of give some sense of some of those sort of issues. So I've got a bit of a composite here of some different images about digital platforms, WhatsApp lynchings in India. I mean, each of them also actually needs some kind of empirical and theoretical kind of unpacking, right? Because there's a sense in which, particularly in media representations about digital technology, certain things get reproduced in even what look like classic moral panics are coming up again. But I think some of these are concerning, that the WhatsApp lynchings in India, the bottom left, then the WhatsApp in the Brazilian election has been something widely debated. And in Indonesia, the ways in which digital platforms have played into the politics and some of the cultural battles about that. In the top right-hand one, I just put this kind of image of the famous sort of alt-right, green frog in a Japanese caricature, to just perhaps mark here that in the platform Ni Chanaru, which was around in the early 2000s, became an outlet. It was a forerunner of 4chan, the platform in the States, and it was notable for the ways in which kind of racist, right-wing hate speech against foreign minorities in Japan was actually kind of played out. So actually these things, of course, are complex. They have cultural specificities and they go back away. So just a couple more. Some of the debates currently about moderation, that many of the dissatisfaction issues at the moment about the sense in which digital platforms are the platforms we do rely on in terms of the public spheres that we have internationally at the present day. And we're trying to make some sense of those. And that you can certainly deploy and develop technologies around those to deal with moderation, such as AI. But one of the screenshots here from Kalev Letaru just say, well, we're still needing human moderators in an AI-powered world. And there's the fantastic book from Tarleton Gillespie, Custodians of the Internet, that actually unpacks this in a lot of detail with a study about moderation. And I think it's a really interesting thing. Moderation was around, it was around in the heyday of email lists in the 90s, right? It was around before that you would moderate a list, you would take it in turns in a kind of, that sense of that internet culture to actually take care of things. And that this is both beyond people and is really complex. And then when you start to do it, which is what the image on the left-hand side, 5 takeaways from Facebook's leaked moderation documents. So Facebook's certainly been in the kind of the spotlight. And one of the things that's been revealed is that the ways in which it does moderation in different settings, in different kind of societies, is problematic. And it's taken them a while to respond to this. And there's some real conundrums about how that occurs. And this has been of great interest to people as well. The cashless society, we've got an image here from the sense in which in different societies, some of the injunction towards the digital has got to the stage. In China, for instance, there's issues about having options for cash. And then finally, some of the data issues that have really concerned people. I gather in Singapore you've had some leaks of data in the middle of last year. In Australia we've had something called My Health Record that about 900,000 people have opted out of because the privacy safeguards were so concerning, particularly I think with Cambridge Analytica revelations and the realisation for people that if you give your data to one platform, they might go and allow a third party to deal with it. So these are huge issues, I think, for users and citizens, and for a lot of other people as well. For people who are developing businesses, for people who are doing technology innovations, who there's a feeling that the frameworks aren't there for them to actually be able to have secure transactions. And I think this probably, yes, this is the final sort of invocation of this sort of legitimation crisis. Virginia Eubanks has written this great book about automated inequalities, studying some of the deployment of automation. And there's a really there are many examples, I'm sure, internationally around this. One in Australia is that our Department of Social Security that provides social support, unemployment benefits, sickness benefits to people, decided to do debt recovery from people it felt actually had taken money but weren't owed it. But they did it in a completely automated way. I mean, it does sort of defy common sense, really, doesn't it? And so on the right-hand side, we've got an instance of a young man with autism who was then hounded about his debts. And so the interesting thing about this is some of this automation affects, quite a diverse group in society, but then a range of people in more marginalised situations as well. And not learning from that, on the left-hand side, the same government agency, Centrelink, has got a new, we call this in Australia, robo-debt, so the kind of robotic debt, bypassing a previous safeguard for the mentally ill. So the ability to learn here is a wonder. Okay, so I think in this legitimation crisis, pushback is pretty evident. Just a couple of examples here, the delete the Facebook account. Recently, people attacking, it's sort of reminiscent of the Luddites, right? And the complex policy of Luddites, people attacking self-driving cars. And my own favourite example, in driving, I live in an area in inner city Sydney, which has actually a park and a river, and they drop the OFO bikes. I think I've seen them here as well. So this deployed bike, no discussion with council or residents. And so people kind of took to the streets. I've got this little montage drown bikes. So that bike was then part of a beautiful river scene. And then there's two bikes. So I kept encountering bikes up trees in rivers. So, okay, so clearly this is a fairly speculative argument. But if this is in crisis, how did this happen and where do we go from here? So I've got, and I'll just be proposing this in the next 10 minutes with detailed argumentation that would surely need to follow. I think there are some kind of recurrent issues here. And in just trying to think through this, to think, okay, well, perhaps why is it now that this sense of things at a crisis, at a crossroads? I mean, this is often rhetoric we use, but it does seem to me, with some of those examples that I've presented, there's a sense in which the last year or two, that has been a problem. And that potentially is a problem when we are looking at investing in, preparing ourselves for, educating our students at institutions like NTU for futures where we're looking at a new wave of technologies. So I think these were just, four kind of things that occurred here. I do think there is an eclipse of the human and environmental in many of the aspects of technology development. Again, you'd have to be a bit specific about this, and I'll fail on that count here. But I think, and this is in some ways a very big swinging generalisation, but I think there's a sense in which the social, cultural, linguistics, ethical, philosophical, aesthetic dimensions of digital technology addressed too little too late. I mean, over against that, in all of these areas, there's many really interesting, positive instances of doing this. But I suppose this comes from studying digital technologies and also being engaged in policy work around this and trying to bring to bear, I suppose, research and translate research into settings around technology, to work with people in technology, designing things with goodwill, with resources, with reasonable policies. But I think one of the things that happens is this too little, too late. I think the second thing is the narrow ways in which dominant versions of the digital is imagined. And I think here the problem is that the idea of the digital as a global technology doesn't reflect the lived digital, the experienced digital, the sort of imagined digital of a lot of great many societies and cultures. In talking about this, there's a lot of lineage in terms of work on social imaginaries. In this area, there's Robin Mansell's book about internet imaginaries. There's Patrice Felice's book from some years ago, L'Internet imaginaire. There's a bunch of people who've worked on this. I think the third thing is the skewed balance between the rapid technology developments and the responsiveness of and transformation in institutions. And I think sometimes part of the discourse about technology has been a kind of anti-institutional or institutionals aren't quite needed, or we need new institutionals flavour to it. But I think there's been a forestalling and a lag in laws, regulation, concepts and practices of governance and rights. I think the interesting thing in the last year is around the world, I think one of the responses have been people saying, actually, yep, we might need some regulations. We don't want to cruel the prospects of what comes from technology, what comes from innovation, what comes from creativity. But, we surely do need to do things about privacy. We surely do need to do things about hate speech. We surely do need to do things about terrorism. We surely do need to do things about racism, sexism, homophobia, various other things online. So I think this has started to change. Democratic deficit. I think one of the perhaps overarching issues is that I think there's been a lack of frameworks, will and resources for wider participation in the shaping of technology and policy in the interests of all groups and users. And I think this for me is kind of interesting as well, because I think one of the things about particularly digital technology and particularly platforms such as the internet, mobile phones, social media is the recurrent rhetoric and I think genuine sense in which these actually offer platforms for participation. So it seems absurd to be saying that actually they don't do that as much. That seems to go against the grain of much popular wisdom to say, that's surely not the case. But I think there is this sense in which that is very much the case. And that's a problem. I think in other areas of technology, because of the significance of the technology, there's more of a sense of people, and there's frameworks that do say in some ways, yes, we do need to consult with users, with citizens, with businesses, with a range of other groups around these issues because it is really significant. So I think there's something complex but important going on here. I'm talking about as a democratic deficit here. Just to talk a little bit about each of these. Okay, so the eclipse of human and other issues. I think, and again, forgive the level of generalisation in this and perhaps the speculative sort of temper. I think the technology is designed with some languages and culture in mind and not others. The history of ASCII, the kind of dominant code, is an obvious one of those. The encoding of some language scripts, but not all, and then it's taken a long while for that to happen. These are kind of complex issues. We wrote with my colleagues Mark McClellan, who did an early book on Japanese cybercultures, and with Hai-Ching Yu, who's a scholar of Chinese new media, we reflected on the histories of technology, culture and language in China and in Japan and how this plays out, especially interesting in Japan in terms of the script issues. And I think some of the script issues are really not in the fore to this, in the understanding of this, and they're incredibly important. They're important when you think through the history across many societies of the take-up of these technologies. And then the language issues become also incredibly important around the content, which I have here, is that some of the platforms, which we assume, well, we don't really assume they'll give us everything. I think when there was the American technology called TiVo about 15 or so years ago, I remember going to a television studies conference where people were presenting, I think the idea was that TiVo would gather all the television available to you and just, kind of make it available and you could kind of look at, watch TV. And we know now that, sort of 20 years on with intellectual property arrangements and different jurisdictions, that's like hopeless. You need any number of streaming services, free to air, to just pin together a kind of package of television. But I think that's even worse when you think about access in terms of different cultural material that might be valued by different groups. There are real assumptions built into that that are quite complex to unpack. On the other hand, of course, there is the sense in which new digital platforms have actually made new material available. And there's a lot of scholarship about that in the ways in which cultural and linguistic groups have actually been able to present, circulate cultural material via the internet. That's another countervailing stream. Okay, the lack of research on social implications of technologies for different groups in society and different kinds of users is a recurrent issue. I think how to put discussion of philosophy and ethics into a central position early on in the development of technology. You can see the efforts now occurring really in earnest with AI. But I think this is a really important question. It's still often not done. And how to make such analyses count in actually what then happens in the career of technologies, I think is a really tricky question. And I'm sure many people may not agree, but many people who've worked in these areas this is sort of something that has some resonance. And I think the ways in which human and other issues are actually, they're constitutional to how technology evolves. And I think this moderation issue is one I'd point to. Okay, to give you a sense of some of the narrow ways in which technology is normatively imagined, which was my perhaps second point. In the work that I've done, particularly around Asian internet histories, I've become really intrigued in the sense in which, and again, wildly generalising across many different diverse contexts, that, for instance, Asian societies have been global leaders in technology and social imaginaries. You think of the Japanese invention of the information society, shaping of the mobile phone, invention of the camera phone, pioneering Korean work. I'm sure other colleagues will be much more expert on this. Broadband society, user-generated content. Singaporean context, also a leader here with the Intelligent Island concept in the early 90s, a smart nation in 2010. North in Malaysia, the Cyber Jaga. More recently, the massive Chinese investments, Internet Plus, made in China 2020, the more controversial social credit scheme. India has its version of this as well, and the Digital India. However, in terms of how then internationally some of the debate on and conceptualisation of digital and emerging technologies is imagined, I think, again, to very crudely and reductively put it, it does have quite a, a Western feel to it. That actually, and even in the way in which I think the debates around AI are now being constructed, I think in really interesting ways. But and it may be just the Anglophone discourses. I don't necessarily hear a lot of the voices from other locations in the leadership, in some of the commanding heights of those debates. I have great admiration for the work my colleagues do at AI Now, or my colleague Genevieve Bell does in setting up her new centre at the ANU. There's some great critics and voices out there, but I think one of the challenges for all of us is how to actually internationalise that. And I think this is really crucial. And in the work we've done from our Internet Histories project, I think our contention is that the histories of the digital have not been actually necessarily written, or the broader histories incorporating Asian perspectives, although the work is there in the scholarship and literatures. But this hasn't been reflected at a global level, yet it has great insights and great potential to reshape our conceptualisation. And this flows into issues such as digital governance and rights. And I think this really kind of needs to change. And I've just got a little quote here from a chapter we've just done on digital rights in Asia, to just say, and part of the point of this is to say, look, there's actually been really interesting work done on digital rights in Asian settings, whether it's in the Philippines, whether it's in Indonesia, whether it's been in Hong Kong, whether it's been in China. But we have globally, there's certain ideas about particular societies and their lack of rights, or how that's framed. And you can see this in some of the ways that freedom is talked about. Yet there's actually, this kind of work should be helping us rethink technologies in a more global sense. So these two other issues I'm pulling out the skewed balance between tech and institutional developments. I think data governance is a example a la mode, and it's a good example of skewed balance. The data has taken on an unprecedented role in the last 2 decades and has presented new challenges and new concepts. We see one of these concepts in the policy arena at the moment, the idea of a consumer data right, that each of us would have a right to our data. That means that even if we signed up an app that helps us organise our finance, we can have the right to get our data back and to take it to someone else. So just a key issue about markets and consumers, right? And to set up for business innovation and technology innovation. But this has taken some work. But really, the fundamentals should have been put in place many years ago. This bit isn't really rocket science, is it? Because after all, Dana Boyd wrote this article in 2008 based on a debacle in 2006 called Facebook's privacy train wreck. Writing versions of the article ever since, not to just put Facebook in the hair triggers. And what's really interesting is in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Directive that came out in the middle of last year, and now many of us had to click through on many platforms to accept the new kind of regime. What's really interesting is the countries where they just hadn't got their act together for various reasons, they've had to quick smart. And this is the case in Australia as well. And the democratic deficit. I think actually this is a problem, that there's been scant involvement of publics, despite the new opportunities to engage publics. You see this in the digital government rhetorics. But actually that hasn't really happened. There's been a kind of sense in which people haven't, I think, felt they were able to get involved, and this has really affected trust. And I think here part of the issue is you've got these 2 powerful actors broadly. The tech companies, the tech corporations, transnational, very large. We've had the spectacle in the last year of various of those corporations being brought to book, so to speak, or some of them. But they're keen to safeguard their profitability, especially if that comes from data. And then states on some issues have a kind of unholy alliance, or could be seen as a holy alliance, about aspects of digital rights. User encryption, digital security, freedom of expression via digital platforms, often on the face of it, legitimate reasons of national security, of terrorism laws, which is incredibly important, but are keen to avoid wider scrutiny and interest. So UNESCO does each year a media development report, and in its report last year, it commented on this kind of relationship of these 2. Okay, so in the last sort of 5 minutes here, I'll just try and draw this together a bit. So I think there's a particular paradox, seems to me, about digital technologies. I think, it's felt hard at times to draw attention to the mounting issues with digital technology. And we could see these at least from the emergence of spam onwards, because there's been a strong belief, and particularly, you can see this, for instance, at the time of the new economy, which led to the hype that the internet economy was something different, until the tech crash of the early 90s and early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. But this sense that digital technology represents a paradigm shift in extending participation, freedom, innovation, solving problems. Of course, yes, it does in unexpected ways. And technology has proliferated, extended globally, and it's crossed over into many sectors where we weren't previously reliant on computing, networks, data, algorithms. But this more so means it's the time to scrutinise technology and to really address these issues. Think, for instance, of the issues of diversity, fairness, inclusion, which many tech industries surely have a problem with, especially highlighted in the kind of post Me Too movement times. Interestingly here, I think actually there's really interesting parallels across the work that's been going on for a long time with public understanding of science, engagement with science and technology that we face across other areas. And I'm not sure that some of that work has been brought into the digital area so often. So just in terms of some of the lessons, I think, for me, there's an understanding, this kind of understanding that technology is created through this mix of people, ideas, practices, machines, institutions, markets is vital. I was really interested to see in having a look at the AI Now group, the NYU group, their toolkit on AI. They make a real point to say, actually, you've always got to think about the technology, the social practices, and the industrial power. which I thought was not a bad kind of way to actually, get that on the table, which I think is some of the issue that perhaps coming from academic settings where we emphasise the complexity, the assembling of the technology, many of the ways and nuanced ways in which this happens, some of the ways we actually can communicate around this is lost. Secondly, the histories of technology and how we creatively imagine these futures is crucial. And I think we need to broaden the inputs into such shaping of technology. And this is work going on, we know, in really interesting ways around the world at the moment. Thinking of the work of people like Sarah Pink, again, Genevieve Bell has been very influential in this. The platforms, resources for creative, systematic engagement with science and technology are essential. This is really crucial. And I think, particularly when we're thinking about making the argument for resources, saying, yeah, well, so what? What happens if they don't actually, resources don't come? Well, things can fail. They can fail quite badly. And fourthly, I think this, the ecosystem cultures and policies of innovation need to capture, support and address the human experience aspects of technologies. I mean, innovation is a really interesting and complex area of policy, but I think sometimes it's a bit two-dimensional, and some of the ways in which we have a sense that these aspects of human experience and other aspects, environmental issues, need to be put into the frame has not occurred. Okay, so this is a conclusion of which there's far too many dot points and lots of text. Many apologies. I can distribute, that's just shocking. I can distribute this afterwards. I got on a roll here. So I think, sure, we need to understand the implications of these developments. And I think that's the first stop. But the second stop, that many of the impasses of technology, which was what I was pointing to before, and that when we're engaged, I'm sure many of you are engaged in sitting down with industry and talking to communities, policymakers, artists, people in the media, a bunch of people about these things. Often the issues are actually, the puzzles actually require putting the human societies and environment back into the picture. These are actually some of the really central issues. And I think one of the implications of this, that I think internationally the Holy Grail, is, how do we bring, universities have this expertise, but they're people in different kind of buildings, different languages, different disciplines. How do we bring this together? Again, a great deal of work has been going on here, but I think it's going to a new level with new imperative to do this. I think with the tech developments also come new opportunities to reinvent relationships across key institutions. And I think, reflecting on the arts, humanities and social sciences, in these areas there's been long-standing work of engagement that's gone on. And many of it actually happens with some allies and perhaps people with institutions with a kind of cognate sense. And these, I think, are some cultural collecting institutions, the so-called GLAM sector, the galleries, libraries, art galleries and museum sectors, as well as university privacy. I think this is where the digital humanities is actually extremely interesting, because I think this new alliance is forming. When you talk about data and you're thinking about data in terms of e-research infrastructure, you think about astronomers and telescopes, which is incredibly important. But if you start to think about cultural data, so who holds cultural data? Well, it's often museums, it's often collections, but it's in universities. So there's part of it, seems to me, the excitement about digital humanities is this goes across. This offers us new models. This seems very much what the work people are doing now. I think the role of researchers in universities is important. In other ways in these debates, as an honest broker and a common facilitative resource. And I think universities have an opportunity to find ways to actually unfurl the creativity and innovation, and to do that bit of the encoding of human experience, right, into how into the whole technology life cycle, just not at bits of it or after the fact, but across the whole life cycle, how that happens. And again, there's lots of really interesting work going on around the world around this. And I think also universities have this opportunity, as well as an expectation. So the governments are saying to universities, you need to much more explain to citizens what you're doing and why it's useful. I mean, a lot of the time that can be seen, and sometimes is, as a threat to independent research and scholarship. There's no doubt there are these tensions and issues. but also I think it is important to put engagement with industry, government, communities, innovators at the heart of technology research in particular, because technology is so central to our lives. I've probably gone on slightly too long, but I'll end there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Goggin, for that certainly very informative, but also very wide-ranging in the range of considerations and issues that you raised regarding the challenges that digital technologies are bringing to the society and humanity, but at the same time also very pointed identification of some of the key issues like democracy, disability, and so on.
Thank you.
Governance, definitely. So many, many issues that one could discuss. So the floor is open now to any questions. Maybe I'd like to start with the first question. I'm very interested in the point that you made, I think, in the previous slide about the human experience. You know, how it must be brought back into the picture in order to understand many of these issues that you raised with us. I was wondering if you could just say a little more about that, maybe with some recent examples or something.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, I suppose what I had in mind here was trying to think through, perhaps it's the innovation aspect. I mean, we might have sort of be slightly in a post-innovation phase in that I think the word was overused. But I suppose there's a sense in which one of the exciting things about technology, and actually one of the exciting things about university, is some of the openness and the scope to really think outside the box in interesting ways. But I suppose I just wondered, do we have, particularly around technology, the kind of environments about innovation that actually ensure that the human experience element is in that? And I'm not entirely sure that we do. I think if you look at, say, formal innovation policies, some of the ones, I probably haven't looked recently at those, I mean, some of them have probably other kinds of settings, but they don't necessarily have such an emphasis on doing things like, let's say engagement with user groups. They don't necessarily have, deploy different kind of tools and approaches to say whether it's the impact statement idea, whether it's a sort of inquiry around the ethics and philosophy of things, whether it's to fund and to bring forward and to engage artists to work around technology. I mean, I suppose these are some of the things I think that, I mean, that happens in other kinds of ways, but I think there is this sort of, for me, to just pose this question, to say, look, because I think one response from people can be to say, well, that's, if you create a kind of open environment at some level, both open in terms of commercially, people can do a startup, or bigger corporations can take on new products, or people can, in a sense of ideas and development, experiment in different ways, then you can factor in human experience. But I don't think we've done that. So I wanted to pose that there as something really important.
Thank you very much. Yes,
thank you for your talk. It's very fascinating. I completely agree with what you suggest here, which is basically to open the black box of digital technology to see what's inside using sort of social constructivism. But I was wondering, because listening to your talk, basically the black box is already open.
Yeah.
You know what's inside. The question is, to what extent that we can regulate what's inside in this process. And because if too much regulation we apply, then it will restrict the creative process of this digital technology. But then if it's too less, then it might have something there. So what is the boundary between how much regulation that we put and how much freedom that we should give to this?
Yeah. Yeah, look, thanks. That's a recurrent and often difficult kind of question. I mean, I suppose it just seems to me that that will be a debating point, right? We will take different approaches to that. And I kind of agree with you to say, you know, we do need some scope. You need scope to experiment and to actually allow that process. And we might not, different technology developments mightn't have happened if there was regulation too early. But I think, on the other hand, you could really point to a number of areas around data, around consumer protection, where, to be honest, it is kind of obvious that at a certain stage, the technology, it might be that when the technology is a bit more mature and it's actually operated in different markets and companies go around and forum shop, and I used to be a regulator too, actually, about 15 years ago in mobile services, so I saw this happen. People would have already run a mobile service in a particular jurisdiction and they would come to another jurisdiction. So there weren't really, there wasn't such an innovation aspect going on, but there were clear consumer issues. So I think it seems to me you could break this down a bit to say, look, there are really obvious kind of areas where consumer regulation could apply, and that we do need to ask questions about why corporations want to forestall this. You know, that said, it's complex, and we see this happening with the gig economy platforms, right? That Uber insists that actually it's employing contractors, they're not workers, they shouldn't have, pensions and so on. And then courts in London are saying at different stages, well, that looks like an employee relationship, right? So, okay, these are kind of debating points. So I want to be a little bit cautious about that, but I do think, you know, the regulation is really crucial. But perhaps if we reframe it a bit broader around the institutional questions, because I think there is some complexity to this. And this is part of the point for the Centre of Excellence we're doing on automated decision-making in society, is to have an ongoing collaboration between computer scientists, the people who've worked more on scholarship of digital technology, and people who work on legal aspects, to see how these go in sync, to try and think this through. But I do think another part of it is actually, you know, it is important to try and articulate some of the issues of values around technology, and that's where I think that can really help. Because I think part of the question is why regulate? Why you regulate? And for instance, in the Australian context, the Human Rights Commission in the last 6 to 9 months has actually got an inquiry on human rights and technology, because it feels things are at the point to say, actually, there are human rights questions here. We think we do need to ask the question. Now, one of the interesting things in that scenario is that the Human Rights Commission under a Conservative government is not a really powerful body. There's another big inquiry into digital platforms that's being done by the Market and Competition Regulator. So you've got a different landscape. Maybe that's another issue about the different kinds of regulations, but it's a very interesting debate. I hope that's useful.
Do you think that the university is a real culprit in the sense that you create what I call technology and humanity divide? I think to me that is basic to that. And number two, is that too much of the Western society, in the name of free market, we therefore allow multinational to lobby and create whatever, give a free hand for the business model. To the point, now we can't control the animal anymore. And on top of that, I think the humanity perhaps should really study, in the humanity study, is the greediness of human. In a sense, is free, therefore now I capture everything by the multinational. Which I was rather surprised, how come you did not address, these are to me fundamental issues.
Yeah.
Is there no point of talking about how we put the human back? It's useless. You have to address the fundamental issues of, do we really, in economic system, how should we do it?
Right. Could you just...
I would like to hear your comment on that.
Very interesting. Could I just get you to clarify a bit about... So you're saying that the terms of this are already determined around this, that it's not so useful to talk about technology and humanity.
Yes, perhaps it is a university who is a real culprit that you create so-called humanity school.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure.
You should perhaps just merge it.
Yeah.
Then you don't have that problem.
Yeah.
Because you create that artificial divide.
Yeah.
Human is not as such.
Yeah. Well,
So I want to hear your view on that.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of agree in a way. I mean, I think at one level I do agree that I think actually, yes, it does seem a bit fatuous to be still reproducing these binaries, right, where they go together. But on the other hand, I think the problem recurs in different ways, that when you do bring people together, you still have people with different worldviews, not just people with different views, but there are quite different worldviews. And there are things going on that when we talk in this context about humanity, I think we are trying to bring more into the picture to get a richer and more complex view around technology that includes a broader range of things, that does more justice to it. So that's why I think it's kind of, I'm okay with using these kind of terms. I think they're useful.
I could just throw another question
Sure.
to you. This is back in 1975,
Right.
where DNA research just started. The whole US was debating, should we regulate DNA research or not?
Right.
And
Yeah.
that debate has been going on up to today. No one seems to put a hand on that.
Yeah.
So this is, to me, another parallel of that.
Yeah.
Same thing happened.
Yeah. I think there's many echoes and
So
Yeah.
that is why perhaps more fundamental than that is go back to what I see that so-called divide humanity and tech. And the other one is the lobby of the multinational.
yeah.
Because the same thing you see in the biotech industry,
Right.
okay? You just push through and they say in the name of free market,
Yeah.
you don't touch it.
Yeah.
So I create whatever business model I want.
Yeah.
In the end, you're being controlled.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I mean,
Yeah,
address that.
sure.
Because to me, if you do not address that, we can talk about all that you are talking about, but we are getting nowhere.
yeah.
I hate to be quite blunt and frank about it.
Sure.
So I want to hear your view on that.
Well, yeah, look, I think that sense, maybe you call it the political economy of it, right? That sort of economic, the very large scale aspect of that is quite influential, the power of corporation. But I suppose I do think there's some more ambiguity and complexity of that, because I do also believe that, something of a mixed economy is a good thing, right? In many, there is a sense in which you've got in around technology, you've had the growth of small businesses, you've had economic opportunities being provided. We've just done some work on disability and social innovation and technology in China and Australia. And one of the interesting things in that is trying to just actually think through these rhetorics about digital technology and entrepreneurship. And the idea, does digital technology provide platforms for people with disability who otherwise are not in the workforce to actually provide economic opportunities? Yes, it does, but on the other hand, some of that's overblown. Yes, it does, but some of the larger forces, the dominance of larger corporations with smaller startups go on. And I think there's different ways in policy that gets addressed, but there's ways in which that doesn't necessarily get addressed. I'm loath in this Trumpian moment to point to global institutions, if they survive, in having that. But clearly those are some of the debates about world trade rules, right? And some of the sense in which, many people have been critical about when, say, cultural policy gets written into bilateral multi-trade rules or other aspects. I'm less familiar with biotech, but some of the debates around biotechnology have very much been around those. So a long conversation, but many thanks for putting it on the agenda.
Any other questions?
My name is Justin. First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm a tech developer, so I develop
Great.
AI tools, and especially in healthcare. And listening to you, of course, I totally agree. But my question is, how do you go from here?
Sure.
I'm developing tools. How do I take those lessons to heart and change my tech
Sure.
such that it fulfills those constraints, if you will? So
Yeah.
I think there's still a gap between hardcore developers who
Yeah.
want to push out technology and the startups want to make money and survive.
Sure.
These investors, and then people like you come up, with very interesting frameworks that are hard to implement in some cases
Yeah.
in the real world, and actually you cut down your profits.
Yeah.
So how do you balance profits and ethics? Would it really be a question?
Good question.
I think
Yeah,
it's a question
no,
we've
thank
been
you.
hearing for many, many years. I think
Yeah.
Nuclear power.
Yeah,
Think about steam engine.
that's right. Yeah.
Environmental issues.
Yeah.
So it's not like something new.
No, that's right.
Technology does on a scale,
Yeah,
but the same issues have been around for
Yeah.
60s, hundreds of years. So
yeah,
I think there's still a gap between practical life, between,
Yeah.
The philosophy
yeah,
and what's really done in the market.
yeah. No, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the tension between, having to make a product or a service that people value, that's useful to people, and then people will, pay some money for, and then you can employ people, you can keep developing things, and then how you take on board the ethical issue is a potential conundrum. But I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I'm sure already you do, you have
I could mention
good practices around that.
Green energy,
Great, yeah.
solar power. So
Yeah.
I think there's hope. I mean, that's possible.
There is hope, and I think
But AI is a bit of a special beast because it's moving so fast.
it's moving so fast. Yeah,
So it's really everywhere.
yeah. So I
In
think
the hands of many people.
Yeah.
Whereas energy is very controlled. You have a few big conglomerates, small energy.
no, interesting.
I think it's different.
A different kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's right.
Scale. Maybe it's a big scale, and plus you have many more actors, many more stakeholders.
No, that's really interesting. So, I mean, I think one of the lessons is the importance of the larger frameworks and the laws and regulations, right? So then people feel they're all on the same, so that, if there's a kind of stipulation that you have to take into account the green aspects, then all your competitors hopefully do the same. Do they do it on an international level? Maybe not, because maybe they forum shop. So it seems to me those larger frameworks are good. I mean, I think the other thing, which I think often happens around with tech developers is around the cultures of innovation. I think actually there's common interests and engagement around having cultures of innovations, conversations, maybe as we are now, that actually there's a lot of really interesting work going on that I see lots of developers working with particular groups of customers around products, right? And I think the technology for good area is one, but a lot of it is actually just finding products. In the work I've been doing around disability, there's many projects where over 30 years people have worked with tech developers around particular services for people with disability or older people or particular groups. I'm in the health field. I think there are many of these as well. So I think part of that I think is the kind of conversations, and that part of the issue with I think smaller businesses that I see is that sometimes they don't have the resources, they don't have the R&D kind of areas, and actually that means that the relationships with researchers can be really useful, because if researchers are a public good, that means that there can be really interesting conversations at least. There can be really interesting exchanges. So I've found that really useful about, yes, this does sound the sort of, trying to articulate some of the larger principles, but actually I think they can be employed, some of this can be employed in really small scale ways as well. So there are a couple of things on the fly, but I don't know if that's kind of useful. But I just wonder if some of that, the smaller issues, or that actually there are some advantages from the sense in which there are many different people doing tech development. But that means there's a lot of diverse work going on, and people have different interests, and it may or may not suit people, or people just don't have the time in the day to be taking on particular things. They can't. But then there's communities as well, right, that you belong to and others, that they become an important forum for those conversations. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I just want to make a comment about the last three speakers to say that I'm kind of sympathetic to you all in a way, because when I think about an example like machine learning, right, the very benefit, the very productive use of machine learning is that it produces knowledge which is inscrutable to us in a way, and that is its benefit. That is why it has an economic imperative to it. But at the same time, how do you regulate that which is unintelligible? And so it becomes this enormous area of moral hazard through which there is no easy solution. And this comes at the same time where we're stuck in forms of cold and narrow AI, which you talked about a lot of that.
Sure.
I'm thinking of that classic quote now that it's not that we have smart algorithms that have taken over the world. It's that we have dumb algorithms and they have still taken over. And so we're in this period now where we're stuck in this cold and narrow AI, and we're so many years away from forms of artificial intelligence that actually have a kind of caring, therapeutic capacity. And so we're in this potentially like a winter period, and your work is trying to find a way to get us through that in a way. In your travels, have you seen any kind of governing authority that has found a way to lessen the coldness and cruelness that you see sometimes? That's a very
No.
harsh way to put it. But when I think of, say, like robo-debt, things that impose cruelties, those almost vulnerable. Do you see any governing authorities that have found a way to avoid that efficient but cold form of governance?
Thank you. That's a lovely and evocative way to put it, actually. It's really, really interesting. I think maybe some of those crueler ones are, at least when they've been called out, maybe have proved a bit easier to try and address, right? Hopefully one presents the robo-debt and people are just shaking their heads, thinking, yeah, and parliaments can actually do something about it. But I think, that what you're pointing to, many people are trying to work on, is the nature of the machines and systems now, where to actually and this is part of the critique of transparency measures around them, isn't it? To say, well, how can this work? You can't, as Christian Sandvik showed, some years ago, trying to reverse engineer your Facebook newsfeed, it's very kind of entirely problematic. So how this I think is a kind of one of the conundrums, and I think trying to find the frameworks around that is where we're at. And I think I don't have anything kind of obvious to kind of point, but it seems to me there are some okay ways to deal with some instances of this in particular settings that are more obvious. And I think some of the work that's gone on is about this. I mean, the other kind, I suppose part of it is the need for actually a better understanding of how these are being embedded. And again, this is a sort of broader idea about our program of work with the Automated Decision-Making Societies, doing some large-scale studies. The one that I would be involved with is actually a study of disability services and social support services, the unemployment benefit and the new disability support scheme in Australia. It's called our National Disability Insurance Scheme, to look at how automation is being deployed. So some of it might be that as researchers, we can actually frame some about the implementation. That could be useful. That seems to me useful, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe one last question, Abel.
I'm interested in cultural and linguistic diversity in terms of digital societies, and I was wondering, nowadays everything is run by one powerful language, one powerful culture, and all the others trying to translate that system into their own language, into their own culture. But I was wondering if you know some alternatives or some initiatives created by people from other languages and cultures to put digital society into their own context to increase cultural representation from other minority languages or minority cultures.
Thank you very much. I feel I don't know as much about this now as I might or I should, so I'd certainly defer with other people. My sense is there is a lot of interesting and significant work going on in diverse settings, and it has been going on for quite a while. I think the localisation of software has, I think, been a long-standing kind of body of work, and I think there's communities that work on these language and technology issues. Then I think around the kind of content issues, I think there's been a lot of work going on. I mean, we did a book in 2009 called Internationalising the Internet, and I vividly remember colleagues from Catalonia doing a piece about, the sort of, I forget the domain name, but they created a domain name for Catalonia, right? As well as the kind of cultural resources. Other colleagues wrote about the sense in which in former Yugoslavia, being able to present their cultural material to diasporic communities was incredibly important. But I suppose, and I know that in sort of international settings, in the UNESCO context and in other settings, cultural policy, heritage work, a lot of work goes on. But I still feel like those issues often lag, right, between and are not brought to bear. It takes a while, and it may be that it takes a while for the base of technology to diffuse to the extent that people say, you know what, iTunes is the sort of thing that lots of people are using. Do we get access to our, the cultural programs that are important to us in whatever our group is, whether it's our nation, whether it's our cultural linguistic grouping? Oh, we need to do something about that. To try and figure out how you can bring that, happening earlier on in the piece. I'm just not sure how that goes, right? And then how that goes in the colleagues from a tech development perspective as well, to think about how that works. And how are people teaming up, I presume they are, in different linguistic cultural communities with developers actually, because that's probably the other part of the piece. There's a lot of innovation, I think, going on with people going, well, we want technology co-developed to address particular issues. So, yeah, I can't offer a snappy answer. That's a bit sort of laborious, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerard.
Thanks.
And with that, all the lessons that we can take away and all the questions that we can continue to discuss, let us thank Professor Gerard Goggin once more for his wonderful lecture.
Thank you.